imagine a 22-year-old guy today, you know, someone in what should theoretically be the absolute peak of his physical prime.
Right, the biological prime.
Exactly. Now, I want you to imagine his grandfather back when he was, say, 35 years old. According to the data we are looking at today, that grandfather, even 13 years older, had significantly higher testosterone levels than his grandson does right now.
It's pretty jarring when you actually look at the numbers.
It's wild. I mean, we are looking at statistics showing sperm counts plummeting by 59% in just a few generations. So the question we have to ask is, are we looking at a biological accident? Or, as the author we are studying today argues, are we witnessing a deliberate societal design?
Yeah, and that's a premise that completely upends how we usually view, modern progress.
It really does. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us. But before we get into the weeds, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss our explorations into the ideas actively shaping our world. Today's mission is massive. We are reviewing an explosive, freshly published 2025 ebook. It's titled Matter and Mind, A Man's Guide to Understanding the Physical and Psychological World, and it's by Conrad Riker.
It's making a lot of waves right now.
A ton of waves. So if you want to follow along with us or dive into the full unvarnished text yourself, you absolutely need to check out Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now to grab a copy. You should also follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack to keep up with his ongoing work.
Yeah, it is definitely a text that requires a close, careful read.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Now, we have specifically curated this deep dive for you, the listener, who wants to understand the controversial, often hidden history of how our modern institutions, from our courts to our schools to, well, even our churches, actually function today. If you've been following the cultural conversations around men's rights, the manosphere, and that argument that traditional institutions were historically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, this book is essentially the blueprint of that worldview. But before we jump in, we really need to set some clear ground rules for our discussion today.
Yeah, it is crucial to frame this correctly right off the bat. Riker explicitly describes his book as a rebellion in hardcover.
That's a hell of a tagline.
Right. He states that it is meant for red-pilled men who are just tired of having their biology pathologized. The material in this book is highly charged, it is heavily politicized, and I mean, it pulls absolutely no punches.
Not at all.
However, our job today is not to take a side. We are not here to endorse these viewpoints, nor are we here to condemn them.
Exactly. We're strictly analytical.
Right. We are going to unpack Riker's core arguments, rigorously lay out the historical data he presents, and just examine his proposed solutions. We are treating this as a fascinating sociological and historical artifact to help you understand a framework that is, frankly, rapidly gaining traction.
Yeah, we are looking at the architecture of his argument. We want to know how the building stands up. And Riker doesn't start by analyzing culture or politics, right? He starts at the absolute bedrock. He starts with biology.
He really does. The foundational argument of Matter and Mind is that masculinity, specifically traditional male instincts, the drive to conquer, to build, to compete, and protect, are currently being actively pathologized by modern society as toxic.
Right, the whole toxic masculinity concept.
Exactly. But Riker argues that these exact traits are not defects to be medicated away. He claims they're the evolutionary drivers that actually built human civilization in the first place.
So he leans heavy into evolutionary psychology here.
Very heavy. A prime example he utilizes is Jordan Peterson's famous lobster analogy to explain human hierarchies.
Okay, let's unpack this lobster analogy because I've heard it mentioned in cultural debates before, but Riker takes it to a very specific physiological level, right? He's talking about serotonin.
Precisely. So, according to the book, lobsters operate on these serotonin-driven dominance hierarchies. When a lobster wins a fight for territory, its brain just floods with serotonin, causing it to physically stretch out and appear larger.
Which obviously helps it secure more territory and mates.
Right. And when it loses, serotonin drops and it physically curls up. Riker argues that these biological dominance hierarchies are not arbitrary social constructs invented by some historical patriarchy, like we're often told.
Yeah.
He says they are hardwired into our neurochemistry, dating back literally hundreds of millions of years before mammals even existed.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
He actually writes that denying the existence of dominance hierarchies is like denying gravity. And I love the visual he uses here. He compares a modern corporate Zoom board meeting to a lobster dominance dispute.
Right, just swapping out exoskeletons for Armani suits and passive-aggressive emails.
Exactly. It's such a great image.
That is the core of his biological thesis. I mean, lions don't hold democratic elections for alpha status, and lobsters don't form exploratory committees to determine who gets the best rock.
No, they definitely don't.
So Riker is arguing that the human male is biologically programmed for a hierarchical struggle, and when society tries to artificially flatten that hierarchy, it creates a profound neurochemical mismatch.
And this brings us back to that hook we started with. Where this gets really interesting is how he connects this hardwired biological baseline to a literal, measurable physical decline that he claims is happening right now in modern men.
Yeah, the data he aggregates is quite alarming if you look at the trend lines.
Let's talk about the statistics he brings out regarding testosterone and sperm counts, because they are intense.
They are. Riker cites research from the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism showing that testosterone levels in American men have been dropping by roughly 1% annually since 1982.
Wow.
And this isn't just about men getting older. This is a population-level, age-matched decline.
Wait, I need to stop you there to make sure I understand this. A 59% drop in sperm counts since 1973. He cites a Hebrew University meta-analysis for this. How is a meta-analysis even standardizing that kind of data across 50 years of different medical practices?
Well, it is a massive epidemiological undertaking, right?
Yeah.
The Hebrew University study looked at thousands of samples across various Western countries, adjusting for age and abstinence times, and they just found a sheer, continuous plummet in sperm concentration.
That is terrifying.
Riker uses this specific metric to argue that this isn't just a cultural shift, it is a physiological crisis. And he correlates this directly with two primary modern culprits: the chemical environment and digital consumption.
Okay, let's break those down. On the environmental side, he focuses heavily on microplastics and dietary shifts, specifically soy, right? But he doesn't just say plastics are bad, he
Right.
really gets into the endocrinology of it.
He does. He points to microplastics in the water supply and the food chain, which he explicitly compares to a modern version of the Roman Empire's lead pipes.
Oh, like a hidden systemic poison.
Exactly. Biologically, he explains how these function as endocrine disruptors. Certain plastics contain chemicals like BPA or phthalates, which have a molecular ring structure that's chemically similar enough to estradiol.
Which is the primary female sex hormone.
Right. And because they're so similar, they can actually bind to the estrogen receptors in a man's cells.
So the body is essentially being tricked. The receptors read the plastic as estrogen, and it just throws off the entire hormonal balance.
That's what he argues. When these xenoestrogens bind, they send a false signal to the endocrine system, which can suppress the body's natural testosterone production.
Unbelievable.
And he pairs this chemical argument with a pretty harsh critique of modern diets, specifically targeting soy-heavy diets and veganism, framing them as not just nutritionally deficient for men, but physically emasculating due to phytoestrogens.
But the environmental aspect is only half the battle in his book. The psychological side is where he introduces some of his most unique and frankly arresting concepts.
Yeah, this part is really wild.
Riker claims that modern men are completely maladapted to high-speed internet, and he zeroes in on pornography. He cites the Journal of Adolescent Health, noting that teens are averaging 78 hours a year watching porn.
And here is where he explains the why behind the damage. He delves into the neurochemistry of dopamine. Now, dopamine is the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation and reward.
Right.
Evolutionarily, it spiked when our ancestors successfully hunted game across the savanna or secured a mate actions that required immense physical effort and real risk.
Right, so the brain rewarded the effort because it ensured survival. It was a biologically expensive process.
Precisely. But Reika argues that endless tabs of high-speed pornography hijack the system through the Coolidge effect.
Jiff, what exactly?
It's the biological phenomenon where males exhibit renewed sexual interest whenever a new female is introduced.
Yeah.
High-speed internet provides infinite novelty without any physical effort or risk. So the brain is flooded with unprecedented levels of dopamine, which causes the dopamine receptors to literally downregulate or numb themselves just to handle the overflow.
Which inevitably leads to a baseline state of complete apathy. And this is where he introduces this wild concept he calls Newtonomics.
Yes.
He essentially uses high-level financial terminology to describe male biology. He compares semen retention to compound interest.
It is a striking metaphor for sure.
Yeah.
In his view, every unspent load is an investment in a man's physical and mental capital.
Wow.
He argues it forces the body to reabsorb nutrients and forces the brain to seek dopamine through difficult real-world achievements rather than digital shortcuts.
He writes that relapsing to porn is like cashing out your 401k to make a cam girl's Mercedes payment.
Yeah, that line really sticks with you.
It turns biological discipline into a literal economic strategy. He argues that engaging in dopamine fasting and rejecting these digital harems rebuilds the neural pathways that society has intentionally allowed to rot away.
Right.
So if we look at this from the perspective of an average guy working a corporate job, what does this all mean for him? Riker compares modern corporate culture to a zoo enclosure for men.
A zoo enclosure.
Yeah, he suggests that mandatory HR mindfulness webinars are just a feeble attempt to override 2 million years of evolutionary wiring.
He finds the modern corporate environment entirely antithetical to male biology. To counter this, he highlights physiological hacks. He mentions Harvard psychology studies which demonstrate that simply adopting power poses, expanding one's physical footprint.
Taking up space.
Exactly. Just doing that can boost testosterone by 20% and lower cortisol. He argues that men are physically built to take up space.
This raises a crucial question, and I want to push back on his premise a bit here.
Go for it.
Is Riker arguing that this biological mismatch, the plastics, the porn, the corporate cubicles, is a deliberate, malicious suppression orchestrated by some ruling class? Or is it just the unfortunate accidental side effect of a comfortable, tech-driven, air-conditioned society that just prioritizes convenience over vitality?
Well, that tension is central to the book, and Riker comes down firmly on the side of deliberate suppression.
Really? He thinks it's intentional.
Yes. He does not view the current state of male passivity as a peaceful evolution. He views passivity as a state of extinction. According to the book, the modern soy boy or beta male isn't necessarily being actively violently oppressed in the traditional sense. Rather, he has surrendered.
Surrendered to what?
To an environment that actively rewards female-centric social cohesion.
Which prioritizes safety, consensus, and conflict avoidance.
Yeah. And it prioritizes those over male biological reality, which thrives on risk, competition, and hierarchy.
He brings up some wild contrasts to illustrate what happens when men reject this surrender. He talks about a Norwegian powerlifter who ate nothing but reindeer meat for a year.
Yeah, that story is crazy.
And he hit testosterone levels of 1,500 nanograms per deciliter. To put that in perspective, Riker claims that surpasses the testosterone levels of a silverback gorilla.
It's an insane physiological feat.
And he contrasts that raw vitality with what he derisively calls the modern socialist. He also points to Joe Rogan's 5 a.m. ice baths and primal scream workouts. Riker frames these not just as extreme fitness routines, but as a philosophical rejection of societal softness.
He quotes Joe Rogan saying, "Masculinity isn't politically correct, it's alert." Riker uses these extreme examples to argue that genuine strength isn't about denying your biology, it's about mastering it.
Right.
His overarching thesis in this section is that modern society demands men amputate their natural instincts and then mocks them for walking with a limp.
Man, that is a brutal image. Amputate your instincts and get mocked for the limp.
It really paints a picture.
So, if biology is the hardware, the absolute baseline of the system, Riker argues that the societal software running on top of it has been actively hijacked to punish that hardware.
Yes, the institutional capture.
Right. Once you understand this biological drive, he says, you start to see how modern institutions were specifically redesigned to suppress it. So let's trace when that shift actually started, because he goes back much further than the typical culture war talking points, right? We're looking at the historical capture of education, religion, and the media.
He certainly does take the long view here. When discussing the education system, Riker doesn't just start with modern college campus politics like a lot of commentators do.
Right, he goes way back.
He goes all the way back to the 1840s, and Horace Mann, who is widely considered the father of the American public education system.
Okay, so what did Mann do?
Well, Riker points out that as the Industrial Revolution demanded a more compliant, punctual workforce, Mann systematically fired male teachers and replaced them with women.
And the specific reason for this, according to Riker, is fascinating. It wasn't just about paying women less, which is the usual historical narrative, right?
Right, it was an ideological shift. Mann wanted to gentle, rowdy boys into submission.
Gentle them, wow.
Exactly. Riker argues this laid the foundation for an educational model that views typical boyish behavior, physicality, restlessness, competition as a flaw rather than a feature.
Which leads to where we are today.
Yeah, the result, according to the data he presents, is that today 80% of K-12 teachers are female. Riker argues this has created a systemic environment where male imagination and kinetic energy are treated as pathologies requiring medication rather than, potential requiring direction.
He gives this deeply unsettling example in the book of a 9-year-old boy in Texas who was flagged by his school for a psychological evaluation. Why? Simply because he was drawing toy tanks and soldiers during his free time.
For Riker, that anecdote perfectly encapsulates what he calls the estrogen enclosure.
Estrogen enclosure.
Yeah, boys are placed in an environment from age 5 that criminalizes their natural interests. And he traces how this enclosure extends into higher education, specifically focusing on the mechanics of Title IX tribunals and university bias response teams.
Right, because Title IX was originally about equal funding for sports. But Riker argues it has morphed into a parallel justice system on campuses.
A parallel, incredibly biased system, according to him.
He cites a Cato Institute study claiming that 68% of Gen Z men now actively bite their tongues around female peers and HR representatives out of a sheer fear of cancellation.
It's a culture of self-censorship.
He even points to the University of Michigan, which at one point instituted a grading rubric that penalized students for gendered microaggressions.
He views these administrative bodies not as educational tools, but as mechanisms of control. He describes the procedural structure of these Title IX courts, where the accused often cannot cross-examine their accuser, and the standard of evidence is drastically lowered compared to a civil court, as intentionally designed to strip men of due process.
It sounds structurally identical to a moral panic.
It really does.
In fact, Riker makes that exact historical analogy. He specifically compares today's cancel culture to the 1486 Malleus Maleficarum. For those who might not know, that was the infamous medieval witch hunting manual written by a Catholic clergyman. Riker claims that today, 78% of canceled individuals are men. So if we look at the mechanics of this, are we essentially witnessing a cyclical moral panic where men are the new default witches?
Riker's argument relies heavily on that exact parallel. He writes that the Malleus Maleficarum was dangerous, not just because of its ideology, but because it taught local mobs how to institutionalize and monetize persecution.
So it provided the blueprint.
Exactly. It created a framework where accusing someone of witchcraft elevated the accuser's social status. Today, he argues, blue-check activists on social media use the exact same psychological tactics to extract social capital, funding, and institutional compliance.
He points to the Duke Lacrosse case as the ultimate modern archetype of this, right? Where men were deemed guilty until proven innocent by the court of public opinion, and even after being legally exonerated, the institutional stigma remained.
Because the goal, according to Riker, is not truth, but ideological fealty. And this capture isn't limited to secular institutions like universities. He goes incredibly hard after modern religion, specifically targeting what he terms woke religion.
This chapter blew my mind, honestly. You'd think traditional religion would be the one bastion of conservative male values, but Riker argues that modern seminaries are prioritizing progressive social justice activism over any traditional muscular theology.
He provides several vivid examples to back this up. He discusses the Episcopal Church in 2007 ordaining a pregnant priest whose first official sermon involved assembling a diaper genie at the altar to symbolize nurturing.
A diaper genie at the altar.
Yeah. He contrasts this with historical martial imagery of Christianity. He also mentions a Brooklyn megachurch that recently staged a gender-fluid passion play featuring a non-binary Pontius Pilate.
He argues this is a literal scrubbing of history. It's not just updating theology, it's melting down statues.
Yes, the rewriting of liturgical calendars and history books is a key piece of his evidence here. He details how St. George, who was traditionally revered for centuries for his dragon-slaying courage and martial virtue, is being reduced in some modern academic theological texts to an anti-reptile colonizer.
An anti-reptile colonizer? That sounds like a parody.
It does, but he cites the texts. He also points to a Catholic school in Dublin that made headlines for removing a 200-year-old traditional statue of St. Michael the Archangel defeating Satan and replacing it with a Greta Thunberg action figure to promote climate awareness.
Okay, so the analysis here is that by erasing these masculine heroic archetypes, the dragon slayers, the warriors, these captured religious institutions are intentionally creating a spiritual void for men. They are offering a theology of passive nurture rather than active conquest.
Precisely.
And he extends this exact same critique to the media in what he calls woke capital.
The corporate and media spheres are where he sees this ideology weaponized on a global scale. He critiques the New York Times' 1619 Project, arguing that it deliberately ignores historical nuance to reframe America's founding not as a triumph of Enlightenment ideals, but as a slavery-centric patriarchy festival.
Designed to delegitimize the very concept of male-led institution building.
Exactly. He also brings up the infamous case of Google firing engineer James Damore.
Oh, right. Let's talk about Damore. Damore wrote an internal memo simply citing peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology to suggest that, hey, perhaps the reason there aren't exactly 50-50 gender splits in coding jobs is due to differing biological interests between men and women.
Right, he was pointing to population-level preferences.
He wasn't saying women couldn't code, and he was fired for it.
For Riker, the Damore firing is the quintessential proof that corporate HR departments have elevated ideology above objective, peer-reviewed science. And he warns that this bias is now being hard-coded into our future.
Through AI.
Yes. He points out that large language models and artificial intelligence are now being heavily programmed with guardrails to block prompts that celebrate male strength or traditional patriarchy, labeling them as toxic.
He mentions a Stanford AI audit that found 78% of tweets containing the phrase, "men are trash," are allowed to stay up indefinitely by moderation algorithms. Riker argues that if the genders were reversed, the algorithmic bans would be instantaneous and permanent.
The double standard is baked into the code.
But as dark as his view on media and tech is, perhaps his most scathing, hilarious, and devastating critique of how deeply compromised academia has become comes through his detailed breakdown of the Sokal squared hoax.
The Sokal squared hoax is absolutely central to his argument that entire academic fields are intellectually bankrupt.
Let me set the scene for this, because the methodology of this hoax exposes the underlying architecture of modern academia.
It really does.
3 academics, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose, intentionally spent a year writing 20 absurd, entirely fake research papers.
Complete gibberish.
Yeah, they filled them with woke buzzwords, postmodern jargon, and absolutely ridiculous conclusions, and then submitted them to the top peer-reviewed journals in fields like gender studies and sociology.
The goal was to test the hypothesis that these journals would publish anything, no matter how logically flawed or factually absurd, as long as it flattered the ideological biases of the editors.
Specifically, biases against white men and Western norms.
Exactly.
And the results were staggering. One paper argued that dog parks are rape-condoning spaces, and that dogs essentially rape lawns to uphold canine hegemony.
Canine hegemony.
I know. Another paper was literally a rewrite of a chapter from Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, just swapping out the original targets with the patriarchy.
Which is terrifying that it got through.
Unbelievable. Another was titled The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct, arguing that the biological male organ is actually a conceptual driver of climate change. And the punchline here. 7 of these undeniably insane hoax papers were accepted and published by prestigious peer-reviewed journals.
Riker uses this incredibly embarrassing failure of the peer review process to assert that these fields are not producing science. He explicitly calls gender studies a $1.5 trillion global grift.
Oh.
He introduces the concept of grievance hydraulics.
Grievance hydraulics, what is that?
It's an institutional mechanism where producing useless inflammatory research leads to claims of systemic oppression, which in turn leads to demands for massive increases in university funding and diversity sinecures.
It's a self-perpetuating outrage machine.
Perfectly stated.
And he contrasts this artificial academic reality with what actual people want. He points to the box office failure of Marvel's recent Phase 4 movies, which he claims feature bumbling, incompetent male heroes serving merely as comic relief to flawless female leads.
Right.
He contrasts those flops with the massive, enduring success of hypermasculine, unapologetic films like John Wick or 300.
His economic analysis here is that audiences inherently crave male archetypes, competence, and heroism. There is a massive market demand for masculinity, but the captured institutions of Hollywood and academia stubbornly refuse to supply it, choosing instead to lecture their consumers.
So we have the biological hardware being suppressed by the environmental software, and we have the systemic capture of our macro institutions, the schools, the churches, the media, and academia. But Riker argues this capture isn't just theoretical or cultural, is it?
It gets very personal.
Right. It trickles down to the most intimate, dangerous, and consequential battlefield for his readers. Romantic relationships and the legal matrix of the family court system. This is where he introduces the phenomenon of the marriage strike.
Yeah, and to truly grasp the severity of the marriage strike, we first have to understand Riker's foundational concept of male disposability.
Right? The idea that society only values men for what they can produce or what they can suffer.
Exactly. He presents stark labor data showing that 93% of all workplace fatalities are male.
93%.
Men are overwhelmingly the ones dying in logging, deep-sea fishing, mining, and roofing.
Like,
These are the brutally dangerous jobs that keep the physical infrastructure of civilization running.
right, without them, the grid goes down.
Yet Riker notes the men working these dangerous blue-collar jobs are constantly lectured about their inherent male privilege by academics and journalists working safely in climate-controlled offices.
It's a glaring paradox. Society absolutely relies on male labor, male sweat, and male sacrifice to function, but simultaneously criminalizes the very masculinity that drives men to do those jobs.
And this realization, according to the book, is what is driving the MGTOW movement, men going their own way.
Let's talk about MGPOW.
MGTOW is a socio-political philosophy where men vow to sever their legal and romantic entanglements with women and the state. Riker claims this movement has grown by 300% since 2015.
300%. That is not a fringe internet subculture anymore. That is a demographic shift.
It really is.
And according to Riker, these men aren't just deciding to stay single because they prefer playing video games. They are actively fleeing a legal system they view as a lethal trap. It sounds like Riker's describing marriage the way a cynical financial advisor describes a toxic asset-all liability. No equity.
That's exactly how he frames it. He calls the modern state-sanctioned marriage contract a plantation and a rigged game where the house always wins. And his analysis of the family court system is blistering and heavily data-driven.
What kind of data?
He points out that 83% of family court judges are female, arguing that this demographic monopoly creates an inherent in-group bias against fathers in custody disputes.
He also looks at the criminal justice overlap, noting that men receive 63% longer criminal sentences than women for committing the exact same crimes.
Right, and his explanation for the sentencing disparity circles back to biology. He argues that juries and judges subconsciously perceive biological markers like testosterone, broad shoulders, and deeper voices as inherent indicators of aggression and threat, effectively punishing men simply for inhabiting a male body.
And then we get to the financial extraction. He traces the history of alimony, which I found totally fascinating. We tend to think of alimony as this timeless institution to protect the vulnerable, but Riker traces its legal precedent back to an 18th century British lord.
Yes, he explains that alimony was essentially invented by aristocratic lords to financially protect their mistresses and discarded wives in an era long before women had any presence in the workforce or property rights.
But Riker argues that applying that 18th century aristocratic framework to the modern dual income era is absurd. He claims alimony is now weaponized by modern courts as a tool to extract wealth from blue-collar workers who are already struggling, effectively indenturing them to their ex-wives.
And the human cost of this extraction is where the tone of the book becomes incredibly somber. Riker brings up profoundly dark statistics from the Journal of Men's Health.
Yeah, these numbers are hard to hear, but they are crucial to his argument.
The journal found that men who are paying child support have an 18% higher suicide rate than the general population.
God, 18%.
Furthermore, overall male suicide rates spike nearly 9 times post-divorce compared to married men or divorced women. For Riker, this isn't just about money. The family court system is literally driving men to end their lives by stripping them of their children, their assets, and their dignity, while threatening them with debtor's prison if they fall behind on payments.
And he emphasizes how the legal system actively weaponizes accusations to ensure this outcome. He references the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. Now, on its face, preventing violence is obviously good, but Riker looks at the funding mechanics.
Right.
He claims VAWA bankrolls over $1 billion annually for female-exclusive domestic violence shelters, while male victims of domestic abuse receive virtually zero federal funding for male-only shelters.
He cites a highly publicized, tragic case from Toronto in 2019 to illustrate the real-world consequences of this ideological policy.
What happened there?
A man was seeking refuge from the freezing cold, but was turned away from a government-funded shelter because they operated under a strict women and children first policy. The man froze to death outside.
That is horrific.
For Riker, this incident proves that a man's worth in the modern system depends entirely on his utility, not his basic humanity. When his utility runs out, society steps over his body.
This level of legal and social peril reminds me of the story he tells about the Michigan man who literally filed court paperwork to divorce his $100,000 student loans.
Oh, yeah, that case.
The judge laughed it out of court, obviously, but the man's logic was entirely aligned with Riker's thesis. If modern marriage contracts, which involve children and lifelong commitments, have less legal permanence than a Snapchat message, it can be dissolved unilaterally at any time without fault. Why should financial contracts be treated with any more reverence?
It highlights the hypocrisy of the contract law.
Exactly. But here's what I want to ask you about this whole section. If the legal framework of marriage is entirely dismantled and irredeemably corrupt, according to Riker, is he arguing for a cultural return to traditional biblical vows? Or is he advocating for the complete and total abandonment of the institution of marriage by men?
Riker is highly pragmatic, almost ruthless on this point.
Yeah.
Philosophically, he clearly respects the historical concept of traditional patriarchal marriage. He notes that historically, fathers carefully vetted and approved unions, and husbands legally and spiritually led the households.
Right.
But practically, he believes that state intervention, specifically no-fault divorce laws and heavily biased family courts, has entirely destroyed that model.
He has that quote in the book, "Love dies, alimony doesn't."
Exactly. So his immediate actionable advice to modern men is to avoid the state-sanctioned marriage contract entirely. Do not sign the paper.
Just opt out.
Yes. He advises men to build their own value, stay legally unmarried to avoid their life's ambition being legally cannibalized by a judge, and if they must cohabitate or have children, they should engage in what he calls jurisdictional arbitrage.
Jurisdictional arbitrage.
Yeah.
Meaning moving your assets and your life to a country or state where the family laws are less predatory towards men.
It's all about risk management for him.
He mentions Elon Musk losing $200 million in a single divorce settlement as a prime, high-profile example of this asymmetric risk. And Riker points out that it isn't just financial risk, it's social and physiological risk.
He spends time contrasting the flippant internet culture of male tears coffee mugs, where female activists mock male distress, with the biological reality of how men and women process conflict.
Oh, this was fascinating.
He points to a UCLA psychological study showing that women's cortisol levels, their primary stress hormones, spike dramatically by up to 30% during social justice arguments or ideological conflicts.
He frames this ideological conflict in modern relationships as literal chemical warfare.
Yeah.
If you are living with someone whose stress hormones are constantly spiking because of cultural conditioning, it just destroys the peace of the home.
Which is exactly why he places such a premium on the necessity of male-only spaces. He describes the 3-chair rule at a traditional barbershop.
I love this analogy. Break down the 3-chair rule for us.
The concept is simple but profound. You sit in the barber's chair the first time, you are a stranger. You sit in it a second time, you are a customer. You sit in it a third time, you are telling the barber the intimate details of your divorce.
Yeah.
Riker frames this kind of unregulated male space as a vital form of organic male therapy. It allows men to discuss their struggles without the vulnerability shaming that he claims men inevitably face from female partners, traditional therapists, or corporate HR departments.
Right. Because as he points out, modern society constantly tells men they need to be more vulnerable, they need to open up, they need to cry. But when men actually do show weakness, when they open up about their fears, they are penalized for it. Their partners lose attraction, or it gets used against them in a custody battle.
It's a trap, in his view.
So that brings us to the final, and undoubtedly the most radical and controversial section of the book, the Sovereign Man's Manifesto. Riker has laid out this incredibly grim diagnosis of biological suppression, historical institutional capture, and the legal trap of modern marriage. But he doesn't leave the reader there to just wallow in despair, does he?
No, he provides a highly detailed survival guide.
Right. How does a man actually operate in a system that Riker believes wants him neutered, physically, financially, and spiritually?
Riker's solution is the pursuit of absolute sovereignty across 3 distinct domains: physical sovereignty, financial sovereignty, and tribal sovereignty. Let's start with the physical, which he terms the fitness imperative.
This goes way beyond just wanting to look good at the beach.
Far beyond it. He believes men must reclaim what he calls biomechanical sovereignty by lifting heavy weights and mastering their physical forms. He writes a line that defines this entire section: every pound of lean muscle mass is a tax shelter against a compliant world.
A tax shelter against a compliant world? That perfectly encapsulates his worldview. It merges the physical with the economic.
For Riker, physical strength is a literal veto power. In a culture that demands softness and compliance, being physically formidable is a visual, biological rejection of what he calls the soy-glazed modern culture. It makes you harder to intimidate, harder to cancel, and harder to control.
But he gets very literal about taxes and control in his second step, financial sovereignty. This is his actual blueprint for escaping what he calls the taxation plantation. It is essentially a step-by-step exit strategy from Western society.
It is a radical blueprint for digital and legal secession from the modern nation-state. Riker outlines a highly specific 5-step plan to essentially ghost your homeland and render yourself financially untouchable.
Okay, let's walk through these steps because the mechanics are fascinating. Step 1.
Step 1. Incorporate via Estonia's e-residency portal.
Estonia.
Yeah. For a €100 fee, a man can log online and establish a digital identity in the Baltics, allowing him to operate a business within the EU without ever stepping foot there.
Wow. Okay, and step 2 is routing your income through that newly created digital LLC. You detach your revenue stream from the country you actually sleep in. What's step 3?
Step 3 involves physical relocation. He advocates acquiring a Dubai Golden Visa. He specifically notes the demographic reality that 96% of the applicants for this visa are male.
96%.
Yes, Dubai offers a zero income tax environment and a culture that does not prioritize Western feminist ideals.
Step 4 is about how you store the wealth you are generating. He tells his readers to aggressively buy Bitcoin and store it on cold wallets, meaning offline USB drives that are completely disconnected from the internet. He explicitly advises against buying real estate.
Right.
Why? Because real estate is physically anchored. It can be seized by a family court judge or taxed by a local municipality. Can't put a house on a USB drive and walk through airport security.
And finally, step 5. Never vote in the jurisdiction where you can be taxed. Riker believes that participating in the democratic process of a captured state is a fool's errand that only validates the system designed to extract your wealth.
He talks about the Estonian girlfriend meme. This is the phenomenon where remote CEOs and digital nomads route all their earnings through Baltic shell companies. Because, as Riker bluntly puts it, your ex-wife can't seize an algorithm.
It's a very vivid way of putting it.
He is advocating for storing your entire financial and legal sovereignty on a piece of flash memory. He calls it pixel patriotism. But I have to pause here and issue a major pushback on his entire underlying thesis.
Let's hear it.
If Riker genuinely believes that testosterone, masculine drive, and male confidence literally built Western civilization from the ground up, and his ultimate solution is for all the capable, red-pilled, high-performing men to take their money to Dubai, route their businesses through Estonia, and go into total monk mode, doesn't that guarantee the absolute collapse of the very Western civilization he claims they built? Is he proposing a temporary labor strike to force negotiations, or is this just an outright surrender?
That is arguably the most profound question raised by his entire manifesto. And Riker anticipates this critique. He frames his strategy not as a surrender, but as a strategic withdrawal, a strike in the most literal sense.
Like Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, where the producers just stopped producing for the system.
Very similar. He compares the men building these opt-out parallel societies to historical conquerors. He likens modern tech workers leveraging Estonian e-residency and crypto to herald Bluetooth raiding England.
So they're digital Vikings.
Exactly. They aren't fleeing in defeat, they are seizing ungovernable space. In Riker's view, the institutions of the West are fully engulfed in flames. You cannot save a burning building that actively hates you. You have to let the structure collapse under its own weight and build something entirely new and structurally sound from the ashes.
But building something new requires a community. You can't build a civilization alone on a laptop in Dubai. Which brings us to his third and final pillar, tribal sovereignty. He argues that it is an absolute biological and social necessity to rebuild male-exclusive spaces. And he details how historically vital organizations like the Freemasons and the Boy Scouts were systematically compromised by DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates, and endless lawsuits, which forced genuine male camaraderie to go underground.
He provides very stark, modern examples of this cultural battle over space. He mentions a warehouse in Phoenix, Arizona that was dubbed Men's Space. It was a simple, gritty facility where local men gathered to lift heavy weights, fix cars, and talk to a chaplain about their struggles.
Like what happened to it?
It was aggressively targeted and shut down by the city council for obscure zoning violations. Meanwhile, Riker points out, a deeply progressive, gender-neutral crystal healing studio in the exact same zoning district was quickly approved and celebrated.
Unbelievable.
He argues that this stark contrast proves that the institutional war on male sanctuaries has nothing to do with building permits. It is entirely about disrupting unauthorized male power.
So because they can't operate in the open, Men are taking these tribes underground. I was blown away by the story of the Boy Scout troops in Montana.
That's a great example.
Riker talks about groups of fathers who pulled their sons out of the official Boy Scouts of America after the organization began banning traditional activities like using whittling knives, labeling them as toxic phallic symbols, and integrating girls.
Instead of complaining, these fathers formed unauthorized underground scouting troops. They meet deep in national parks to teach their sons traditional survival skills: how to hunt, how to field dress an animal, how to fish, and how to completely ignore the concept of modern gender pronouns.
He calls this movement backyard patristics and muscular Christianity. He describes his own travels while researching the book, including a trip to Budapest. He recounts sparring in a converted subterranean Soviet-era bunker with a Catholic priest.
That scene is incredible.
Right. Between boxing rounds, this priest is aggressively quoting St. Augustine and Winston Churchill.
For Riker, this underground bunker in Hungary is a glimpse into the future. He sees men gathering in unheated garages, flipping massive tractor tires, reciting classical philosophy, and drinking bourbon as the literal genesis of a new, untamed civilization. It is a total rejection of the neutered, passive theology we discussed earlier, and a return to what he coins as testosterone.
Let's define testosterone, because it really ties his whole psychological and biological theory together. He defines it as the biological algorithm that forces men to chase risk and volatility.
Yes.
He claims this neurochemical drive is exactly why 87% of all cryptocurrency traders are men. They have a deep-seated biological imperative to take massive, uncalculated risks to explore the frontier, compared to administrative bureaucrats who crave safety, regulation, and consensus.
And that concept brings the entire book full circle. For Riker, the sequence is clear and undeniable. Biology drives behavior. Modern institutions were captured to suppress that biology. The legal system was weaponized to punish anyone who acts on it.
Right.
Therefore, the only rational, mathematically sound response for a self-respecting man is to cleanly exit the system, protect his capital, and rebuild tribal alliances based purely on risk, physical strength, and merit.
So what does this all mean? We have meticulously covered the biological baseline of testosterone and dopamine, the historical capture of schools and churches, the legal traps of modern marriage, and the radical exit strategy of digital sovereignty.
If we zoom out and connect all of these dots to the bigger picture, it raises an incredibly provocative, perhaps even dangerous question for society at large.
What's the ultimate takeaway?
If Riker's data is accurate, and if this silent exodus of highly capable men continues to accelerate at the current pace,
Which he claims is happening right now.
yes. If millions of men are actively shifting their capital out of fiat currency and into crypto, moving their physical residencies and businesses to places like Dubai, refusing to sign marriage contracts, and migrating their social lives into underground decentralized tribes, well, we might be witnessing the end of the traditional Western nation-state's ability to tax and govern its most productive citizens.
That is profound.
The real question we're left with isn't just whether modern institutions are failing men. Riker considers that a settled fact. The existential question is whether modern Western society can even survive, let alone thrive, if its most driven men successfully build a parallel, untaxable, unapologetically masculine world that simply leaves the old one behind.
That is an incredibly chilling, fascinating, and paradigm-shifting thought to end on. If this deep dive resonated with you today, or if you simply want to read the raw data, the deep historical footnotes, and the full, unvarnished arguments for yourself without any filter, you absolutely need to pick up this book. Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now, search for it, and buy Matter and Mind, A Man's Guide to Understanding the Physical and Psychological World by Conrad Riker. And make sure to follow the author's ongoing cutting-edge work at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
It is undeniably a text that will fundamentally challenge your assumptions about how the world works, regardless of where you currently stand.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these in-depth explorations into the books, the sources, and the hidden data that are actively shaping our cultural conversation. Until next time, stay sharp and keep questioning the narrative.